Hi there and welcome to Central Texas Gardener. I'm Tom Spencer. As much as we love our trees, it's not unusual for gardeners to neglect their care until something goes wrong. Today, certified arborist Guy LeBlanc has a few easy tips to keep your trees in good shape. On tour, see how Laura Joseph explores the world of ferns under a canopy of old oaks.
Laura Joseph knows how to bring out the creative spirit in everyone she meets. She also knows how to create companionship through her neighborhood Purple Martins, her work at Zilker Botanical Garden, and in her own garden that connects people with explorations into the plant world.
I was primarily a weekend gardener because I was working, of course, but I've been gardening for, well, really all of my adult life. I've gone through different phases. I went through the azalea phase when I was a big azalea grower.
Then she married Cater Joseph and moved to his historic Greek Revival home in South Austin, where rocks outnumber the soil.
When Cater and I married and I moved here, I brought with me 5,000 caladium tubers. And I really intended to make this a fabulous tropical caladium garden. And I planted them all, but as quickly as I got them in the ground, the armadillos dug them up. And I thought, there's got to be another way.
A few years later, she found a resource at Zilker Botanical Garden when she became a member of the Zilker Garden Club. Eventually, she joined several of the over 30 garden clubs at Zilker and served as president of its board, the Austin Area Garden Council.
Joining the Zilker Garden Club put me in contact with other people just like me.
At home, she'd already brought in yards of soil for plantings to grace the historic home and its heirloom oaks with formality. From the beginning, Laura gave the front garden definition, framing its diverse areas with plants and confirming their purpose with a place to sit and enjoy them. On the driveway stretch alongside the neighbor's house, one of the sunnier spots, Laura chose brilliance to frame new patios. She tucked in a pond where she and Cater, or neighbors out for a stroll, can sit for a spell. In back, a pergola signals departure from the public garden to the family and friends' courtyard. Eventually, everyone ends up at the outdoor dining room. Her latest addition is styled after a Texas dance hall.
I wanted to have a place to store furniture and a place to pot up plants.
But with all the pool traffic, including her granddaughter and the neighborhood kids, she turned the shed into a shower and bathrooms. Back and front, every space includes ferns.
I like a tropical feel, and ferns have sort of been the backbone. I've always been interested in ferns. When I was growing up, everybody had big pots of Boston ferns on their porch, and we didn't. My father played the piano on our porch in his boxer shorts, and I kept wondering why everybody else had ferns and I was too stupid to realize the value of a father who played the piano in his boxer shorts. But I did make a plan when I was a very small child that I would have ferns on the porch, and I have.
She also has plants that her childhood neighbors would never have recognized as ferns, though some are in pots. Others flourish in beds. And her collection of epiphytic staghorn ferns includes many mounted on boards.
nurseries around here are carrying more unusual plants, and I've been able to add to my fern collection locally now. But originally I bought practically everything online.
Through Zilker Botanical's Garden Club of Austin, she spreads the fern passion through their public garden and seminars. Then Laura discovered anthuriums.
I've always been interested in unusual plants. I really like new and different plants. I'm on the lookout for plants all the time.
One of them is a papaya in the driveway garden that grew from seed in just a few months. Laura planted a surprise just beyond it.
The Aristolochia, Dutchman's pipe, came to me from my brother who was traveling in Costa Rica, and he gathered a little seed packet and brought it to me. I like growing things, and I like watching the life cycle of all different kinds of plants.
Laura also likes the transitory tropicals from Brazil, who return in late February before heading north in midsummer. The neighborhood hotspot on the adjoining lot that Josephs own started when Laura realized that her trees discouraged the purple martins she was trying to attract.
One day I put one of my martin houses over on the lot because there's a wide open area and that's what martins like. And within a couple of days, martins had moved in. So now, and that was about 10 years ago, and now we have the largest martin colony in Travis County.
The whole neighborhood gets involved. Families adopt nights to monitor the nestlings and fend off sparrows and starlings.
World's cutest dog right here.
They're little beaks. Isn't that amazing? Pretty feathered out. They're getting big. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Look at that. There's a hungry fellow right in front of me.
Hello. Look, in this one, look. Look. Jordan, there's a bunch in there. Look at all the tiny babies.
It brings a lot of joy to people, and so that makes me feel good.
Thanks so much, Laura, for sharing your garden with us. And right now we're going to be talking about trees, summer tips for survival, and how to diagnose problems or prevent problems from ever happening to your trees. I'm joined by Guy LeBlanc, who's an arborist with Arbor Vitae Tree Care, and it's a great pleasure to have you back on Central Texas Garden. It's been a while.
Yes, it's been a long time. Thanks, Tom.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Guy. And, you know, thinking about tree care, so many people, wait until problems exist. But carefully planting trees and carefully maintaining them really prevents so many of the common mistakes. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we're going to try to do today, is kind of walk people through proper planting of trees. And let's start right there.
Okay.
What are the most common mistakes that you see that come from when people are planting a tree?
Well, I think it really starts with site selection. We have a saying, right tree in the right place. And it's one of the most common things overlooked by people. A very obvious consideration is overhead power lines. We need to be careful when we're planting large shade trees that we're not planting them directly under power lines. But likewise, many communities now and neighborhoods have underground utilities, so we need to be especially careful, especially for our own safety, about the possible existence of underground utilities.
Right.
You also need to consider such things as property lines. You don't want to be encroaching on a neighbor too much with a very large shade tree.
Right.
And then finally, the function that the tree is going to serve for us as well has a great deal to do with where we're going to place the tree.
Yeah, so, and this is one thing I try to get people to think about. And increasingly, people are finding that yards are downsized. And a lot of people, that's a preference. They don't want a giant yard to take care of. But choosing a tree for a very small yard, a tight space, is very different from one with an expansive front yard, for example.
It is a very difficult for species selection there. Oftentimes nowadays these buildings that are on smaller lots are very, very large, and so the building itself is casting an incredible shadow. So we need to consider not just the mature size of the tree, but also what its light needs are. Most large shade trees are going to want lots of light for most of the day,
Right.
so we're probably going to need to choose not only smaller species in that situation, but species that are a little bit more shade tolerant.
Now, one thing, I think this is an area that we haven't explored a whole lot in Central Texas Gardener in the past, and I think it would be real interesting for people to hear is when you go in a nursery and you say, I want a shade tree, or whatever kind of tree you might be looking for, they take you to the spot, and there are 30 of the same tree.
Right.
How can you just visually go through those trees and determine, hey, this one looks more healthy, this one looks more vigorous than the rest? What are the tips that people need to be looking for?
Well, that gets us into the second part of your plan for getting off on a right start, and that's with your specimen selection. And there are several key things I like to look at. Since I like to recommend to folks to plant smaller trees rather than go for the instant shade, because a smaller tree will adapt better to the site. And the good news about that, it's beneficial or advantageous in many ways, but one of the ways is that a smaller tree, we don't have to worry too much about many of the above ground defects that the tree might have in terms of structure, because many of those branches ultimately aren't going to be on the tree.
Sure.
But we do want to look for the foliage color and foliage quantity and foliage size. These are indicators of general plant health. I tend to recommend, especially for large shade trees, that we want single trunk trees. Most of the other above ground defects, again, we can deal with over time. But most importantly, people really need to look underground. One of the biggest problems that we see time and time again with relatively young trees is the girdling roots. And this is where roots inside of the pot that the tree is grown in have begun to swirl around the inside of that container, and they've become hardened in that state. So if the plant is removed from the ground, put in the ground in that state, those roots are going to continue to grow in that circular manner. They're not going to distribute to the soil, give the plant the stability and the nutrient and water uptake it needs, and typically within 10 years it's going to die.
Yeah, and I've heard time and time again on the radio people describing trees that they put in the ground and look perfectly healthy. They died unexpectedly and rather quickly, and this often is the case.
Yes.
The roots are girdled. So let's, again, thinking some tips for folks. I don't think it's uncalled for to, when you're looking at plants in the nursery and they seem full for the pot size, maybe exploring the look of the roots.
I always recommend it, and I've always done it personally when purchasing trees for myself and for clients. With a larger tree, that gets tougher to do, and if the tree has roots coming out of the bottom of the pot, it's going to make it very tough. It's a tip-off that you're very likely to have girdling roots, but it's also going to make it pretty hard to get it out of the pot.
Yeah. Well, and you know, if you go to pick up the plant in the nursery and it's growing into the ground, that may not be the one you want.
Exactly. You might want to pass on that one. And other things to look for is damage to the trunk. Also, a tree that cannot stand on its own. They're typically bound up or surrounded by many other trees. If you pull it aside and it can't stand up on its own, that certainly isn't a plant you're going to want, because we would prefer to avoid staking, and we can talk about staking also.
Well, and let's do that. I mean, I mean, this is a common question that people have. They bring a young tree home, they set it out, they think, I've seen young trees staked, so they do it, kind of automatic reflex. But really, that's not an ideal.
It really isn't. Actually, industry standards call for not staking trees unless necessary. And in my opinion, unless necessary would mean that perhaps you've chosen the wrong plant, or the wrong plant's been given to you. If you have an extremely windy site or an particularly dense crowned tree with very wet soils that might be a bit more prone to being blown over, you might want to stake in that situation. I would recommend the stakes stay on for no more than a year, and you have to pay close attention to whether or not the webbing material that you attach to the stakes is not going to gouge into the trunk or branches.
Okay.
But ideally, you really prefer to have a tree that is not staked.
So again, look for a good specimen that's going to stand on its own, and to let it stand on its own.
Absolutely.
Now, planting itself, people make a lot of mistakes in terms of planting depth. This is another big issue that I have to diagnose often on the radio. People plant typically too deep on the trees. What's your recommendation?
I agree. That's probably one of the most common mistakes made. And again, standard industry recommendation is to plant that tree so that the root flare is exactly at the level of the ground. The root flare is where the very base of the trunk starts to widen laterally into the roots. Now, sometimes that's hidden because in the nursery, either dirt has accumulated or it was actually planted too deep when it was repotted at a nursery. So if you don't see that root flare at the base when it's in the nursery, it might be a tip to avoid that plant as well.
Yeah, and generally I'm beginning to tell people, you know, the soil level in the pot should be about an inch above the soil level around. It's a good way to just avoid that problem if you can.
Yes, because you may get some settling, which would then put the plant too deeply. So planting a little bit high, as you suggest, about an inch, would be preferable to too deep.
Yeah.
I ideally like to recommend that we be right at grade, provided that we do have a good firm base under the plant that's not going to settle.
Okay, great. Now, summer survival tips. Say somebody has put a new tree in the ground. If you want to avoid problems, what are the most important things people need to be thinking about right now?
Well, the best thing to do is to plant in the fall so that by the time summer comes around, that tree has as much of a root system as it can going into the summer season. Planting now, your tree is going to be much more likely to be drought susceptible. So summer survival tips would boil down to water, water, water.
Yeah.
But if you are adding proper soil amendments, top dressing with proper soil amendments, these are going to give you good moisture retention in your soil, and that can also be beneficial.
Yeah, so you know, basically when you say water, 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 what I tell people is, you know, initially when the plant goes in the ground, remember it's been watered every day, so several times a week at least.
Yes.
But the ideal is to get it to one good deep watering a week. Would you say that it would be accurate?
Yes, but I think that if a tree was planted, say about recently, it's going to need much more than that to get through that first summer. I would think 3 times a week minimum. Depending on the drainage of the soil, it might need even more frequency than that.
All right. Well, Guy, these have been great tips for people who are out hunting for trees or wanting to take care of young ones. We really appreciate you coming back on the program.
Thank you.
Again, Guy LeBlanc from Arbor Vitae Tree Care here in Austin. It's been a pleasure visiting with you again.
Thanks, Tom.
And coming up next, it's Skip Richter.
Hello and welcome to Down to Earth. This week's question regards, how do I properly identify insects, diseases, and other problems in the landscape? You may have noticed you go outside and you see something that you haven't seen before. Perhaps it's not one we talked about on the question and answer segment of the show, and you wonder, how do I get help with this? Well, one of the best ways is to contact your local extension office and bring the plan in for identification, but it's important to take a good sample. If your problem is in your turf, you want to make sure and bring in turf that's sick, not dead. You want to make sure that the sample has living grass and whatever disease or insects might be present in it. So we go to that zone between healthy and dead and take our sample there. Just remember, we can diagnose, but we can't do autopsies. So don't bring in the dead materials, just something that shows the symptoms. If you can bring it in at different stages of the problem, that also helps. If you bring in insects, make sure they're in a bag or jar so they don't escape on the way, and we can identify those for you. The service is free of charge. If you go to the klru.org/CTG website, you can find a link to an email service at our office as well, where you can send digital photos and you don't even have to drive over. And again, that's a free service. Just take a good digital photo that's in focus, send it to us, and our master gardeners and agents will take a look at it and diagnose the problem. If we need to bring specialists in, we can do that as well. And again, it's all free. Our featured plant this week is plumbago. I love plumbago because it takes the heat. It really loves our Austin summer weather. You know, plumbago is one of those plants that is blue, but yet blooms through the summer months really well. It grows in sun, but it grows really well in partial shade. You don't have to water it quite as much. As long as there's adequate light, I'll say medium shade to very, very light shade, it'll bloom for you. In sun, it blooms really well also. Plumbago is a perennial. It comes back year after year. Some winters, when we have an exceptionally cold winter, you might want to make sure that it has a little mulch around the base, but it's a plant also that doesn't have any insect or disease problems that we're having to spray for. Another good reason to choose Plumbago. The common color is blue, but there's also a white form if you'd like to use that. Out in the garden, it's time to plant color for the heat. Just because it gets hot here doesn't mean we have to give up on color in the landscape. Most landscapes around you turn into a sea of green when summer arrives. But by choosing color plants that can take the heat, and there's a lot of them that we can use, you can continue to have color on through the summer. I like to choose plants that have colorful foliage. Things like coleus, for example, in a semi-shaded area can really provide a lot of color. You're quite familiar with caladiums and others that people use. Persian shield is another one with beautiful purple color and silvery streaks in the leaves. So whether it's sun or shade, there are plants that will continue to bloom through the summer, and we want to choose those. It's time to raise that mower blade up if you haven't already. By mowing your lawn too short, you're just inviting more weed problems and stress in the turf. So get that blade up as high as you can stand to see it. For more plant tips and to contact the Extension office in your county, visit klru.org/CTG.
Thanks, Skip. Now let's check in with Trisha Shirey for Backyard Basics.
Today I'm going to share some of my favorite garden plants, and I hope that they'll become your favorites too. Now, one that I just absolutely have to have every year is Magilla Perilla. And Magilla Perilla looks a lot like coleus, but it's a lot better than coleus. It doesn't tend to have the bug problems, and you don't have to cut the blooms off all the time like you do with coleus plants. It gets to be a very large plant. One of these plants can easily be 3 feet tall by 3 feet wide. So when you use it in a pot, just put one. I do like to underplant it with sweet potato vines, with petunias. Especially love the chartreuse sweet potato and this new copper tone sweet potato vine underneath it. And it appreciates afternoon shade. So whether it's in the ground or in a pot, if you have it someplace where it's in afternoon shade, it'll do beautifully. It also can be used as an interior plant in your home. Now there's also a Magilla Perilla vanilla plant. It's a little bit lighter in color and does appreciate afternoon shade. And both these perillas will grow easily from cuttings. So if you want to take some cuttings in the fall and overwinter those in the house, you can do that, or just take your perilla containers inside the greenhouse, and they should survive through the winter and then give you another year of service in the garden. Now, another great plant is the Philippine violet. If you've got a lot of shade in your garden like I do, you love some tall blooming plants, and this one is a showstopper when it's blooming. This last winter, mine didn't die back, so it's really large still and is already blooming. I thought they just bloomed in the fall, but this one's got lots and lots of blooms. It does come in a white form that I have not found to be quite as freeze hardy, and it comes in a violet and white variegated form as well. And I love the deep blue-green foliage on this one. It really is a stunner in the backdrop of your garden. Another plant that's great for shady areas is heuchera or coral bells, and it comes in a lot of different colors. Now the Palace Purple, I've had one of these for years. There's another new introduction here that is just a fabulous purple color, and it comes in many, many different foliage colors. The secret I found with it is morning sun, afternoon shade, and a fairly rich soil with mulch. Don't let it dry out too much between waterings. It does bloom. The blooms are really showy too, but the foliage alone is worth growing this plant for. And it will be eventually about 1 foot to 1.5 feet wide and about 8 to 10 inches tall. So not a huge plant in your garden, but definitely a nice filler. This is a new pineapple sage that has a chartreuse color, and it has the same wonderful pineapple scented foliage and the great reddish color flowers, but this chartreuse color is just a great pop in your garden. Now this one also, like the regular sweet pineapple sage, loves afternoon shade. But my favorite plants in the garden have to be these ornamental peppers. There's the black pearl, the calico, the jigsaw, the Peruvian purple, and all of them are just very dramatic. They have this deep purple foliage in this case, and little purple berries that are round in the black pearl, and then those berries turn red. This jigsaw has some variegation of white and pink in it too. They're great container plants. They'll take sun, full sun, really hot sun. They'll take some shade too. They're good in containers. And this plant I found last year, it's called Hot Fire. I had that over winter in my yard in a container, and it was not in the greenhouse, and it did beautifully. You can see that the seeds get kind of wrinkly and red. At that point, pull them off, plant them. They grow very easily from seed. So add some of these colorful peppers to your garden. You will be so impressed with them, and your friends will ask you about them all the time because they're just terrific.
For more tips, online video, and our weekly blog, check out klru.org/CTG. Until next week, I'll see you in the garden. Visit klru.org/CTG to learn more about today's program, upcoming events, and to sign up for our electronic newsletter. Check out John's how-to tips and visit Trisha's Corner for ideas inside and out. Get growing at klru.org/CTG.